In the year 1296, a Chinese envoy stepped onto the soil of the Khmer Empire. His name was Zhou Daguan. He had been sent by the Yuan court to the distant kingdom known in China as Zhenla, a powerful state deep in mainland Southeast Asia. He expected a tropical frontier kingdom. What he found instead was one of the largest and most extraordinary cities on Earth. At that time, Angkor was still a functioning imperial capital, a vast urban complex of temples, reservoirs, wooden palaces, and hundreds of thousands of people. Though its greatest king, Jayavarman VII, had died decades earlier, the city still pulsed with life. And Zhou Daguan would become the only foreign visitor to leave a detailed eyewitness account of it before its gradual decline. The journey inland was long and humid. Zhou traveled through river systems that carried goods, people, and tribute toward the imperial heartland. Boats passed fishermen casting nets into muddy waters. Rice fields shimmered beneath the tropical sun. As the envoy approached the capital region, the scale of water engineering became impossible to ignore. Vast reservoirs, barays, stretched like inland seas. Canals carved in precise lines cut across the landscape, feeding fields that produced enormous quantities of rice. This was not merely a religious civilization of temples. It was an organized, hydraulic empire. The prosperity of Angkor was built on water. Then, rising above the trees, he saw stone. The walled city of Angkor Thom appeared like a geometric mountain from the jungle plain. A vast moat surrounded it, wide and reflective, stretching hundreds of meters across. At the south gate, Zhou would have crossed a monumental stone causeway. On either side stood rows of massive carved figures, devas and asuras, gods and demons, each gripping the body of a naga serpent. Above the gateway towered serene faces carved in stone, gazing in 4 directions. These faces, associated today with the Temple of Bayon, represented divine kingship, possibly Avalokiteshvara, possibly the king himself. For Zhou Daguan, the effect must have been overwhelming. This was not a provincial capital. This was an imperial metropolis. Inside the walls, the city did not resemble the stone grandeur of its gates. Most of Angkor was made of wood. Houses stood elevated on stilts, roofs were thatched, walkways were packed earth. Markets formed organically along roads and open spaces. Zhou observed that women dominated commerce. They sat on woven mats selling rice, dried fish, fruits, vegetables, and betel nut. Trade was conducted without minted coinage. Goods were exchanged through barter or measured units of rice and metal. He described clothing in careful detail. Common people, adapted to the tropical climate, wore minimal garments. Men often wrapped simple cloth around the waist. Women wore skirts and occasionally adorned themselves with jewelry. In contrast, the elite glittered. Gold bracelets, earrings, and finely woven silk indicated rank. Parasols signified status. The greater the official, the more elaborate the shade carried above him. Zhou noticed strict social hierarchy. Slaves existed. Servants attended nobles. Officials carried symbols of authority. The society was structured and disciplined, yet vibrant with daily life. Children played in shaded courtyards. Monks passed quietly through streets. Elephants transported goods and occasionally nobles. Angkor was not silent stone. It was movement. Perhaps the most important description Zhou left was of the royal palace. Unlike the temples that survive today, the palace was constructed primarily of wood. That is why it no longer stands. He described it as elevated, enclosed, and guarded. High wooden structures stood within a restricted inner compound. Only officials of certain rank were permitted entry. Guards bearing spears controlled movement. The king appeared rarely in public. When he did, golden parasols shaded him. Courtiers prostrated themselves fully, pressing their foreheads to the ground. Zhou observed elaborate court etiquette. Officials knelt in prescribed formations. Rank determined distance from the throne. The ritual of kingship was carefully choreographed. The king was not simply a political ruler. He was a sacred figure within a cosmological order. By the late 13th century, Angkor was undergoing religious transformation. Earlier rulers had favored Hindu devotion, particularly to Shiva and Vishnu. But during and after the reign of Jayavarman VII, Mahayana Buddhism had flourished. Zhou recorded the presence of Buddhist monks in saffron robes. He also described Brahmins performing rituals. Temples stood throughout the city, some ancient, some newer. The great temple complex of Angkor Wat, originally dedicated to Vishnu in the 12th century, still dominated the sacred landscape. Though Angkor's territorial power had begun to wane by Zhou's time, the memory of expansion remained strong. He observed soldiers and war elephants. Stone roads radiated outward from the capital, linking distant provinces. The infrastructure spoke of former dominance across mainland Southeast Asia. Even in gradual decline, Angkor was still formidable. Zhou Daguan remained in Angkor for nearly a year. When he returned to China, he compiled his observations into what would become customs of Cambodia. Without his record, much of daily life in Angkor would be unknown. The wooden palace would be forgotten, the market women invisible, the court rituals lost. Today, only stone survives. But through his writing, we glimpse the living city, not just its temples, but its people. When Zhou Daguan left Angkor, he departed a city still vibrant. Within 2 centuries, the imperial capital would shift southward. The jungle would slowly reclaim much of the urban sprawl. Yet for a brief moment in history, a Chinese envoy stood at the center of one of the world's greatest civilizations and wrote it down. And because he did, Angkor still speaks.